time to start our story time. We're going to be reading The Mysteries of London. It was a penny dreadful, which was a name given to stories at this time in the Victorian era that were written essentially in weekly installments, published like a chapter at a time. They tended to be over the top and very dramatic and very exciting stories, and they were sold for a penny an installment, so they're often called that. The Mysteries of London was published in 1844. Over the course of 52 weeks. It was written by George WM Reynolds. And it has been established that this was the most widely read single work of fiction in Britain throughout most of the Victorian era. So this was arguably the most popular and widely read of the penny dreadfuls. So we'll see how it goes. This is one I haven't read before. All right, here we go. Chapter 1, The Old House in Smithfield. Our narrative opens at the commencement of July 1831. The night was dark and stormy. It was a dark and stormy night. The sun had set behind huge piles of dingy purple clouds, which, after losing the golden hue with which they were for a while tinged, became somber and menacing. The blue portions of the sky that here and there had appeared before the sunset were now rapidly covered over with those murky clouds which are the hiding places of the storm, and which seemed to roll themselves together in dense and compact masses ere they commenced the elemental war. In the same manner do the earthly squadrons of cavalry and mighty columns of infantry form themselves into one collective armament, that the power of their onslaught may be the more terrific and irresistible. The canopy of dark and threatening clouds was formed over London, and a stifling heat, which there was not a breath of wind to allay or mitigate, pervaded the streets of the great metropolis. Everything portended an awful storm. In the palace of the peer and the hovel of the artisan, the windows were thrown up, and at many, both men and women, stood to contemplate the scene, timid children crowding behind them. The heat became more and more oppressive. At length, large drops of rain fell, at intervals of 2 or 3 inches apart, upon the pavement, and then a flash of lightning, like the forked tongue of one of those fiery serpents of which we read in tales of magic and enchantment, darted forth from the black clouds overhead. At an interval of a few seconds, the roar of the thunder, reverberating through the arches of heaven, now sinking, now exalting its fearful tone, like the iron wheels of a chariot, rolled over a road with patches of uneven pavement here and there, stunned every ear and struck terror into many a heart, the innocent as well as the guilty. Ooh, I feel like that's a foreshadowing. It died away like the chariot in the distance, and then all was solemnly still. The interval of silence which succeeds the protracted thunderclap is appalling in the extreme. A little while, and again the lightning illuminated the entire vault above, and again the thunder in unequal tames, amongst which was one resembling the rattling of many vast iron bars together, awoke every echo of the metropolis from north to south and from east to west. This time the dread interval of silence was suddenly interrupted by the torrents of rain that now deluged the streets. There was not a breath of air, and the rain fell as perpendicularly straight as a line, but with it came a sense of freshness and of a pure atmosphere, which formed an agreeable and cheering contrast to the previously suffocating heat. It was like the spring of the oasis to the wanderer in the burning desert. But still the lightning played and the thunder rolled above. At the first explosion of the storm, amidst the thousands of men and women and children who were seen hastening hither and thither in all directions, as if they were flying from the plague, was one person on whose exterior none could gaze without being inspired with a mingled sentiment of admiration and interest. He was a youth, apparently not more than 16 years of age, although taller than boys usually are at that period of life. But the tenderness of his years was divined by the extreme juvenile loveliness of his countenance, which was as fair and delicate as that of a young girl. His long, luxuriant hair, of a beautiful light chestnut color, and here and there borrowing dark shades from the frequent undulations in which it rolled, flowed not only over the collar of his closely buttoned blue frock coat, but also upon his shoulders. Its extreme profusion, and the singular manner in which he wore it, were, however partially concealed by the breadth of the brim of his hat that was placed, as it were, entirely upon the back of his head, and, being thus thrown off his countenance, revealed the high, intelligent, and polished forehead above which that rich hair was carefully parted. His frock coat, which was single-breasted and buttoned up to the throat, set off his symmetrical and elegant figure to the greatest advantage. His shoulders were broad, but were characterized by that fine fall or slope which is so much admired in the opposite sex. He wore spurs upon the heels of his diminutive polished boots, and in his hand he carried a light riding whip, but he was upon foot and alone, and when the first flash of lightning dazzled his expressive hazel eyes, he was hastily traversing the foul and filthy arena of Smithfield Market. An imagination poetically inspired would suppose a similitude of a beautiful flower upon a fetid manure heap. It's a good explanation. He cast a glance which may almost be termed one of affright around, and his cheek became flushed, and he had evidently lost his way and was uncertain where to obtain an asylum against the coming storm. The thunder burst above his head, and a momentary shudder passed over his frame. He accosted a man to inquire his way, but the answer he received was rude, and associated with a ribald joke. He had not courage to demand a second time the information he sought, but with a species of haughty disdain at the threatening storm, and a proud reliance upon himself, proceeded onwards at random. He even slackened his pace, a contemptuous smile curled his lips, and the glittering white teeth appeared as it were between two rose leaves. I think this guy's supposed to be cute. Yeah, I think so. His chest, which was very prominent, rose up and down almost convulsively, for it was evident that he endeavored to master conflicting feelings of vexation, alarm, and disgust, all produced by the position in which he found himself. To one so young, so delicate, and so frank in appearance, the mere fact of losing his way in a disgusting neighborhood during an impending storm and insulted by a low-life ruffian was not the mere trifle which it would have been considered by the hardy and experienced man of the world. Not a public conveyance was to be seen, and the doors of all the houses around appeared inhospitably closed, and every moment it seemed to grow darker. Accident conducted the interesting young stranger into that labyrinth of narrow and dirty streets which lies in the immediate vicinity of the northwestern angle of Smithfield Market. It was in this horrible neighborhood that the youth was now wandering. He was evidently shocked at the idea that human beings could dwell in such fetid and unwholesome dens, for he gazed with wonder, disgust, and alarm upon the houses on either side. It seemed as if he had never beheld till now a labyrinth of dwellings, whose very aspect appeared to speak of hideous poverty and fearful crime. Meantime the lightning flashed, and the thunder rolled, and at length the rain poured down in torrents. Obeying a mechanical impulse, the youth rushed up the steps of the house at the end of one of those dark, narrow, and dirty streets, the ominous appearance of which was every now and then revealed to him by a light streaming from a narrow window, or the glare of the lightning. The framework of the door projected somewhat, and appeared to offer a partial protection from the rain. The youth drew as closely up to it as possible, but to his surprise it yielded behind him and burst open. With difficulty he saved himself from falling backwards into the passage with which the door communicated. Sorry, I'm just thinking any door that opens on its own on a rainy night probably is not a good idea. Having recovered from the sudden alarm with which this incident had inspired him, his next sentiment was one of pleasure to think that he had thus found a more secure asylum against the tempest. He, however, felt wearied, desperately wearied, and his was not a frame calculated to bear up against the oppressive and crushing feelings of fatigue. Dry throat. He determined to penetrate amidst the profound darkness by which he was surrounded into the dwelling, thinking that if there were any inmates, they would not refuse him the accommodation of a chair, and if there were none, he might find a seat upon the staircase. He advanced along the passage and groped about. How's it even dark? How does he not know this is a bad idea? His hand encountered the lock of a door. He opened it and entered a room. All was dark as pitch. At that moment, a flash of lightning, more than usually vivid and prolonged, illuminated the entire scene. The glance which he cast around was as rapid as the glare which made objects visible to him for a few moments. He was in a room entirely empty, but in the middle of the floor, only 3 feet from the spot where he stood, there was a large square of jet blackness. The lightning passed away. Utter darkness again surrounded him, and he was unable to ascertain what that black square, so well defined and apparent upon the dirty floor, could be. An indescribable sensation of fear crept over him, and the perspiration broke out upon his forehead in large drops. His knees bent beneath him, and retreating a few steps, he leaned against the doorposts for support. He was alone, in an uninhabited house, in the midst of a horrible neighborhood, and all the fearful tales of midnight murders which he had ever heard or read rushed to his memory. Yeah, should have rushed to your memory a few minutes ago. Then, by a strange but natural freak of the fancy, those appalling deeds of blood and crime were suddenly associated with that incomprehensible but ominous black square upon the floor. He was in the midst of this terrible waking dream, this more than ideal nightmare, when hasty steps approached the front door from the street, and without stopping entered the passage. The youth crept silently toward the farther end, the perspiration oozing from every pore. He felt the staircase with his hands. The footsteps advanced. And, light as the fawn, he hurried up the stairs. So noiseless were his motions that his presence was not noticed by the newcomers, who, in their turns, also ascended the stairs. The youth reached a landing and hastily felt for the doors of the rooms in which it communicated. In another moment, he was in a chamber at the back part of the house. He closed the door and placed himself against it with all his strength. Forgetful, poor youth, that his fragile form was unavailing with all its power against even the single arm of a man of ordinary strength. Meantime, the newcomers ascended the stairs. That's the end of chapter 1. He's alone in a house in a scary neighborhood, and he's a total wimp. This isn't going to end well. Okay, we'll see you next time.